Hello there. So I'm in the city centre of Bristol, my hometown at the moment, and I'm just visiting just to see what's going on around town. I've not been here for a week or so, just making a short video, and it's just really quiet actually. You know, there's like 1/100th of the people you'd normally see around. It's like being out in the night time, but it's actually the middle of the day. It's just really surreal, and just like so many shops are closed at the moment. There's police that are outside various shopping centres, so I'm being moved on if I sit down too long and told I've got to keep moving as part of some bizarre ritual at the moment. Unless I'm exercising, I'm not allowed to be out. I don't really understand it or why, quite frankly. I don't think it's that dangerous or anything myself. I'm respecting other people's beliefs that it is, on the other hand, trying to keep a respectful social distance from other people at the very least. Now, here in the city centre, most of the shops, as you can see, are closed, are boarded up with the various signs on them, and there's just literally hardly anyone around. A few people. There's a little socially distanced queue at the bank. There's some pigeons at least, and but it's a lovely day out actually, and I'm sort of haven't slept all night, so I am slightly deranged, but doing okay despite that, I think, and enjoying the nice warm weather that we've been having recently, at least. Yes, I think it's been the most surreal and bizarre time, actually. You see quite a lot of people out with various masks on, and I suppose that would confirm that they are themselves quite concerned about the risk of the infection. I suppose I'm more concerned about the possible long-term risks of the loss of civil liberties, and that there's no guarantee at the moment that any of those long-held rights, the right to assemble, the right to see family and loved ones, there's no guarantee that any of those rights will be reinstated at some point in the future. So, it's quite... and now you can see the reason why many people have been at home. There's countless warnings out and about. Just that same rhetoric telling people repeatedly to stay at home. Well, I don't see the evidence personally that this particular infection, the COVID-19 strain of the coronavirus, that it's any more dangerous than influenza. And I'm not going to say that without having done some initial research. In fact, I've spent a long time looking at the evidence so far, which does seem to be quite clearly suggesting that it's got a fairly low mortality rate comparable with ordinary influenza. And at the moment, the spread, the rate of the infection in the general population doesn't seem to be anything worse than what would generally be a bad flu epidemic. Something that happens quite regularly. To give you some numbers behind that, we had 30 to 50,000 people die, reportedly just a few years ago, in fact, in the United Kingdom. That was widely reported in many newspapers, and so far, people alleged to have died from the COVID-19 strain of coronavirus is reported to be, at the moment in the UK, about 16,000. So, and there's alleged about 30,000 that have died from infections generally, pneumonia and other viral infections like influenza. So it really does seem at the moment that the statistics are not showing that it is a serious pandemic that warrants such extreme measures as the closure of so many businesses and the banning of all groups, from churches to mosques, temples to synagogues, fates to fairs, to even support groups, family members not seeing each other, all that sort of thing. It's good to see buses are still running at least, But there again is a real contradiction, isn't it, when you think about it? Groups of strangers are getting close to each other, in close proximity, touching the handrails, touching the doors. If there was a genuine virus, that's the perfect way to spread it, surely. In the same way that, people in supermarkets, touching various things, various products, and you just think, after they wait the whole long time in the queue, they're all within a metre of the cashier or the shop assistant. So that's, that seems quite bizarre in itself as well. What I'm saying is there's inconsistencies in what those regulations are. And it does seem, to me at least, quite bizarre. And, I can't really account for that. But I do feel at the moment, I, like many people, have probably erred on the side of caution, thinking, well, you know what? At first, I had my doubts. I thought it was a gross overreaction. And I still do. But I thought I'll err on the side of caution because I felt, the fact that so many people were talking about it, that the advice was being given by experts, so it appeared. But I've later discovered that various different doctors dispute those accounts and that it varies considerably. Many virologists who are saying there's really no need for the extreme measures of the social isolation, and in fact that prevents herd immunity from happening, in fact. But there's a lot of debate and discussion within that. I'm not saying that it's obvious and that it must be this theory or that one, but I'm encouraging people to look at it, to research and investigate. And the reason is because if you argue and believe that the measures are justified in the short term, at least for the next few weeks, as we've had extended here, then you could simply use that same argument to continue ever extending those same measures for the next few months, and in fact perhaps even years. Now, there are articles coming out today that have been around for the last few weeks circulating, and they're in the national newspapers speculating that the measures could be much longer indeed. Some reports suggesting 12 to 18 months at least. I think The Sun was speculating that many pubs will stay closed potentially until Christmas, the end of the year. I've had limited contact to try and gauge what people's reaction to that is. But I suppose one can only guess, really. My own feelings are that, yes, it's quite one thing to sort of suspend your life for a few weeks or even a couple of months. It's probably, for the majority of us, it's nothing that concerning. At most, it's probably a frustration, an annoyance, and it is. But my concern is that there are a minority of people at the moment that may well be suffering much more. And our Darwinian attitude that just because some of us are doing okay, just because many of us are stronger mentally or physically and more well equipped and prepared to deal with it, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is, though. And that there may well be some people today that are struggling and that do have significantly more problems, perhaps because they're under more stresses. Just to give you a few brief examples, think of adolescents or children who may depend on social relations more. And if deprived of that over a longer term, that could well cause various emotional and mental problems for them. There could be people with learning difficulties or long-term psychosocial mental health problems. People that could really depend upon vital support networks that may be taken away from them. Thinking about single parents that may have relied on their extended family so much more. Thinking about families, indeed, that can't see each other. Children that can't visit their grandparents. Or even uncles or aunts, or even their own friends. Now, okay, I'm not going to say, and I don't want to overblow that problem, because most of our experience is that it's probably just an annoyance. And in actual fact, I probably suspect those people with very severe long-term physical and mental health problems probably had some support in place that hopefully will be continued at least. In actual fact, my concern on the mental health spectrum would probably be more for those with moderate problems that probably don't have severe enough problems to have merited long-term interventionist care, like visiting from health professionals, home carers and support workers. That kind of support, you would hope at least, would have been recognised and should already still be in place, as key workers and care assistants would continue providing that care, hopefully. But those people without official diagnoses that still had some degree of problems, enough to make it a challenge in their lives, you know, that did still rely on going to their workplace, the church group, the mosque, the community centre, the synagogue, the temple, or meeting up just with some friends for a cup of tea and a chat, you know, seeing someone in person. Now, I'm not saying depriving them of that for a few weeks is going to unravel them and cause some psychotic episode. I think that would be jumping to an extreme, because probably someone that's in that kind of extreme condition, at least you would hope, might have some support in place already. But even someone that only has moderate problems, you know, that may be prone to drink too much, to take drugs too much, to get angry, and may have domestic abuse issues, if under intense strain over a long enough period, at what point do those people become more susceptible to risk? At what point could they be broken? You know, how many weeks or months? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that people with moderate problems in that kind of area are much more larger and widespread group. And so that's why that's much more concerning. And I think that will probably be the developing concern as the weeks go on. We've got at least another few weeks here from the extension, but the government gave no timeline, no definitive end as to when that might be, just some sort of vague assurances. So we really don't know. And much speculation, as I said, suggesting that at least some of the measures could be going on for many months and perhaps even beyond that. But as well as concerns for those people with moderate to severe mental health problems, and others too, there's also concern developing amongst some with people with long-term physical health problems too, and that people that have serious enough health conditions, they may not be perhaps getting some of the support that they need. Well, at the moment, you know, it's been estimated recently that attendances to A&E are down 50% on their normal amount. So that's quite a, you know, on what the regular amount would normally be this year. And, you know, why is that? I'm not too sure. There could be a number of different reasons. You know, you might speculate people are staying home more, so they're less prone to accidents, perhaps. People are not going out drinking so much, you know, getting into fights or falling over. And perhaps there's an element of that. But it may also be that some people with some long-term illnesses are no longer going into hospitals for fear of contracting this virus. They may well be staying home rather than seeking medical attention. So we're not sure how much of that element too could be contributing. So it's a complicated situation, and there may be a number of other factors besides those as well. And it's an ever-changing organic situation. So we're going to be looking for a lot more evidence and information to back that up, and to sort of research what kind of impact that is having on people with long-term physical health problems. Because actually, those are the at-risk group, to be honest, from this strain, and from other infections more generally too, of course. So we do need to be cautious about how those people are being affected. You know, hospitals up and down the country have been cancelling appointments. It was estimated recently that all the rescheduled appointments will take up to 5 years to reschedule. That's an incredibly long time. But who knows? You know, I myself, from a personal level, I've had a long-term illness for about 9 or 10 months now. I can only describe it as something like a neck infection, just pains in my neck and these weird body aches that I get. And the doctors were going to refer me to have a scan done to try and determine what it was, because a number of blood tests that I've had done so far haven't determined that. But as the doctor said, you know, we're not going to be able to give you any kind of scan or hospital appointment to find out what the cause of these pains are, because everything is being cancelled due to the COVID-19 fears. So I've got a personal vested interest to that as well. Well, I didn't really get my hopes up, and I kind of don't have any guarantee that the scan would produce any results or lead to any possible treatments anyway. But you know, there could be thousands more people that have potential illnesses that they're not going to potentially get looked at or tested for or checked up on. You know, people are having all sorts of different appointments cancelled. So I want to do more research, and I hope and I will encourage other people to do that, to find out what kind of effect that might be having on other people, because I think that's a really important element of it all too at the moment. Just to go back to what I was saying earlier, I think in terms of the public mood on it all, I think probably early on there was some frustration, and that's continued. But I think people tend to, mostly my contacts online, be viewing it as a necessary thing, and as a necessary annoyance, I suppose. But there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of recognition yet about the potential for a limited number of people to be suffering due to this current situation. And I'm also not yet hearing a lot of concerns about what if it becomes more of a long-term issue. And there you can see the church there is closed, well, they all are at the moment, and that's just you know, I suppose if you look at it from a spiritual point of view, there could be some religious people that feel aggrieved that they're not able to go and worship and pray with other people of faith. I don't personally. I'm not part of any organised religion or political groups. I like to praise and worship on my own, but there are sometimes I'd like to do it with other people. Not that, but I mean, I think I've had mixed feelings about that myself, where I agree with the words and the hymns, and it's a wonderful binding experience, but when you don't, and somebody's singing or saying something that you absolutely don't agree with, you know, it can in fact lead to frustration, anger, resentment, arguments, you know. So I have typically tended to avoid organised systems like that, because it's quite hard to argue against large groups that are very dogmatic in their beliefs. Whereas I tend to be quite more flexible on some things at least. But having said all that, there will be some people that may be more upset about that than others. But I think I tend to look at that as a social group as well. You know, people will be missing various social groups. But this frustration that people have, you know, it will be to a varying extent. You know, people will experience it differently, and it's going to hit some people much harder than others. For some of us, it's not been a huge transition or adjustment. In fact, there's a lot of contacts that I've had online who've said to me, I was already quite isolated anyway. I've hardly noticed a big difference. And in actual fact, there's been a tendency over many years for many of us to be somewhat more isolated, or just seeing people online more. That being said, there are many people that will struggle with it a lot more. But I think that's something that will only happen as time goes by. Perhaps it won't really hit many more people, a larger number, until many months, in fact, have gone past. I don't think a lot of people are going to question the dominance of the narrative at the moment, the justification, because I don't think it's really harming them that much in the short term, and because also they have got vested interests in believing that at some point in the not too distant future these measures will be lifted, and that we'll go back to having social relations as it was before. Well, I'd like to think that would be too. That's based on something of an assumption and yet to be proven, and we don't know the future. It could well be, as many articles are suggesting, that these are intended as longer term measures, in fact. That some articles in some papers are suggesting that social distancing, and some of them are arguing for it, that social distancing should be continued for many months, even years, some articles say. One article actually said 2022, in 2 years' time, the social distancing should continue to. Now, I don't know about you, but I think there would be a very limited support for long-term continuity of such a thing like that. I personally feel that would be a very hard sell, and that might lead a lot of people to re-examine the actual justification and how necessary it is. But at least, even if they still think it's necessary, at least they might contemplate and weigh up what those potential benefits are against the potential risks, not just to vulnerable groups, but also the wider community, if they should experience this long-term isolation. And I don't want to go on too much longer, but the long-term risks of isolation have been well studied in psychology journals. You've only got to study the effects that's had on pensioners with very limited contact. They're a very good subject to study, in fact, because there's large numbers of elderly people who have endured long periods of isolation, many months, and some of them sadly for many years. I spent years visiting mum in care homes, and sad to say I witnessed many elderly people, and the cognitive decline is something that is very much coupled with the decline in social abilities, and that stands to reason, doesn't it? The less you're able to communicate with other people and actively engage in talking to them in social practices, then your own ability to be cognitive, to discern, to discuss, that will gradually decline and get worse and become harder. I'd encourage you to do research on that, and it's really important that we all concern ourselves with the what ifs. What are we going to do? If it's mandatory and they say social isolation must continue, public gatherings must stay banned. If that is the order for many months to come, and indeed for years potentially, then we've all got to, individually but also collectively, we've got to ask our conscience, we've got to confront ourselves with what are we going to do about that? What's the adequate response to that? Well, that's a long-term question. I'm not going to prompt answers. It's for each of us to look within our heart and make our own decisions at the right time, if and when that time comes. And I feel at some point it will. But let's not jump the gun. Let's go and take each day at a time and judge the situation as it occurs as much as we can. Well, I'm going to carry on walking, and I wish you all well, and I hope I've not offended anyone in what I've said so far. I really do have my fears about where this could all end up, though, and as much as I have actually even appreciated having some time away from others and having time away from various arguments and misunderstandings, I also feel I miss people somewhat, and I really wouldn't want to contemplate a long life without others. I really think that when we're thinking about the risks of social isolation and being deprived of companionship with our fellow man, we really need to be considering what are the great benefits, the great virtues of social support. What are those many intricate and differing relationships that really help to make our character of who we are as a person? Your relationship to your parents, perhaps, to your children, to your brothers and sisters. It may be to your neighbours, it may be to your friends, to your colleagues, to your clients. It could be to various community groups, your brethren, right? It could be to people that you've got various interests in common with, that share a passion or a hobby of yours. You know, it could be a loved one. You know, it could be an ex-partner. You know, it could be your cousins. There's a whole wealth of different kinds of relationships that we all have, and it's worthwhile us taking the time to consider. You know, I'm sure some of the relationships might even improve. Absence makes the heart grow fonder and all that. But that's in the short term I'm talking about. You know, dare any of us really contemplate giving up the wealth of all these different relationships that make up who we are? You know, because I think that would be really sad. You know, social distancing as a short-term thing, I can understand people do it to err on the side of caution, as am I. But I think as a long-term measure, I think it would be something that we wouldn't want to do. I think it would be something that would unhinge the very society that we're living in, quite frankly. I think we could even be looking at the destruction of society as we've known it. And I don't want to sort of scare people into that, but a pandemic of pathological behaviours is potentially what lies in wait for us if we allow the measures to be justified without question and allow them to become the long-term normal new, as the many articles are referencing it as. Because I don't call it the new normal, I call it the new abnormal, the new mental illness. And it is a collective madness. And I'm sorry to say that. It's not justified by any of the evidence whatsoever. If you take the time to properly look at it, and you will find a wealth of different doctors and virologists in particular who are supporting the data that mortality rate is no more deadly than ordinary influenza. Now, I'm hearing all these anecdotes and horror stories of people dying left, right and centre, medics dying and all this. Well, you know what? Death is nothing new. You know, thousands of people die each year from various influenzas and infectious diseases. 3 million people, roughly, were reported to die of pneumonia just last year. They are vast numbers. And when you look at all the reported hospital people that are dying, well, those figures alone are meaningless without looking at the wider context, because such vast numbers work for hospitals. Here in the UK alone, the NHS is the largest employer, in fact. It employs 1.2 million people, over 400,000 doctors, nurses, midwives and GPs. Vast numbers. Now, given that 600,000 people on average die in the UK each year, right? That's like 1 in 80, okay? Something like 1 in 80, 1 in 90, roughly. But given that, you would expect a proportion of those 400,000 frontline medical staff to die as well. That would just be in line with the average UK deaths each year. Well, you'd expect at least 4,000 to 5,000, and that's a conservative estimate. And that works out at several hundred a month. Those would just be average deaths. So reporting, you know, so-and-so doctors have died, okay, but doctors die every year too. They're not gods and infallible. They don't live forever either. It's sad to say it. People of all different professions die. And several hundred doctors or nurses dying would not be above the actual average of UK deaths anyway. If you consider 1,500, that's 1,500 people die in the UK each day, right? Do the sums, multiply it up. What you need to compare is, if you want to look at the overall context, is looking and comparing the reported number of overall medics dying compared to what the average would have been last year and in the years preceding that. Otherwise, it becomes a meaningless figure that I could just barter around to scare people with. We need to be looking at the actual overall figures compared to what the average figures would have been for the years before that. And if I hear all these horror stories about it was a painful and agonising death, it was terrible, yes, some deaths are like that. It's awful and sad to say that, but as a home carer, I witnessed many people suffering awful like that. Struggling for breath, in pain every time they move, is a horrendous thing. And influenza, not to make light of it, if you have a long-term pre-existing condition, is pretty awful to have. Struggling and gasping for each breath. So I do think, I wouldn't make light of any kind of death of that sort. And I think it's worthwhile remembering that suffering and death is nothing new. So I think, individual anecdotes, though moving and heartbreaking as they are, don't necessarily portray the whole picture that we're looking at. So I'm now wandering into a completely different area, and I've wandered off now. There do seem to be a lot more people around, at least in here. But again, it seems like most of the shops are closed at the moment, so